The reading of my father's will began beneath the echoing arches of St. Vincent's Cathedral in Boston, just hours after his coffin was lowered into the ground. Rain hammered against the stained glass windows as if the heavens themselves were unsettled by what was about to unfold. Candles flickered along the altar, throwing shadows over polished mahogany pews, where my siblings Adrian and Luciana sat straight-backed, rehearsed, already smiling like victors. And me, I sat 2 rows behind, staring at the crucifix overhead, wondering if God had any sense of humor left. My family had gathered for grief, but what we really came for was division of property, of legacy, of blood itself. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd like to pause. If you're watching this, I want you to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you tuning in from? Does this kind of family betrayal strike a chord with your own experience? I read every comment, and they remind me I'm not alone in this. And if stories like mine resonate with you, please subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who might need to hear it. We're building a community here, one truth at a time. My name is Elena Marquez. I'm 30 years old, and I've spent my life working as a research analyst for a nonprofit in Boston, though my last name suggests I should have been sipping champagne on private jets. Richard Marquez, the man in the polished coffin, was my father. At least in name. He built a financial empire that stretched from New York to Madrid, but he never built a place for me at his table. I was the daughter of his mistake, born from an affair with a woman who died when I was barely old enough to remember her face. The lawyer cleared his throat, and suddenly the silence turned brittle. To my son Adrian, he read, "I leave the Marquez estates in New York and Boston, along with the full investment trust." Adrian adjusted the cufflinks he'd already stolen from father's dresser and smirked like the crown had finally been placed on his head. To my daughter Luciana, the lawyer continued, "I leave the fleet of vintage cars, the villa in Marbella, and the family foundation fund." Luciana dabbed the corner of her eye with a silk handkerchief, more for show than sorrow, before squeezing her politician husband's hand in triumph. Then came my name. To my daughter Elena. The pause stretched long enough for both of them to lean forward like wolves scenting blood. The lawyer reached under the table and placed before me not deeds, not accounts, not even jewelry, but a small wooden box. Dust clung to its hinges. It looked more like something forgotten in an attic than an heirloom. Adrian chuckled under his breath. Luciana let out a sharp laugh, and I felt every eye in that cathedral burn through me like I was the punchline to a joke they'd all rehearsed. Yet as I touched the box light as air, I caught sight of something stranger at the back pew, a woman I didn't know, staring straight at me. Her face was pale, her eyes urgent. And just as suddenly she slipped out into the rain before I could breathe a word. The storm outside howled louder. Inside, the silence cut deeper. And I realized whatever was inside that box, it wasn't meant to comfort me. It was meant to unravel everything. The wooden box still pressed against my palms as I left the cathedral that night, but its weight was nothing compared to the memories it dragged back with it. You see, for Adrian and Luciana, the name Marquez was a crown polished, paraded, engraved on every invitation. For me, it was a curse whispered behind closed doors, a stain tucked into footnotes. I was never part of the official family register. At school events, my name was always missing from the programs. At family gatherings, I was seated at the far end of the table, my chair closer to the servants than to my father. I didn't grow up in marble halls like they did. My earliest years were spent in the damp stone corridors of a convent outside Worcester. The nuns gave me porridge and second-hand clothes, but at least they gave me kindness, something my father never bothered with. It was only after my mother's death in that so-called accident, the car fire, that erased her from this world that Richard Marquez reluctantly had me brought into the edges of his orbit. Edges that word fits. Never the center, never belonging, always circling the family like a satellite condemned to shadow. There was one voice in those convent years that stayed with me. Sister Agnes. She was not young nor particularly gentle, but she had eyes that saw straight through pretense. Elena, she'd tell me as I scrubbed pews or carried buckets of water, don't waste your life begging for a seat at a table built on lies. Don't seek recognition, seek truth. At 10 years old, I didn't understand. At 30, I hear her in every heartbeat. When I finally earned a full scholarship to Harvard, I thought maybe, just maybe, that would change something. I arrived at the mansion on Beacon Hill with my acceptance letter in hand, shaking with pride. I imagined my father for once might look at me with something other than vague obligation. Instead, he read the letter in silence, set it down beside his whiskey glass, and muttered, "Adrian got into Yale without financial aid." That was it. No congratulations, no pride, just another comparison, another reminder that even my achievements couldn't buy me legitimacy. Adrian and Luciana had their paths paved with gold. Their names opened doors before they even learned how to turn a key. Mine slammed in my face. When I applied for an internship at the Marquez firm, my application was lost. When I showed up at a charity gala, Adrian announced loudly, "Oh, look, our family scholarship case has arrived." Laughter followed me out into the night like a trail of knives. I learned to live in silence, to build a life parallel to theirs. Research analyst for a non-profit, modest apartment public transit. While they drove vintage Jaguars, I rode the T. While they signed contracts in glass towers, I signed petitions on the streets. And yet part of me kept wondering if there would ever be a day when the Marquez name meant something more than a scar. That day in the cathedral, with the storm outside and the box in my hands, I realized Sister Agnes had been right all along. Recognition was never coming. But truth had finally arrived, and it was waiting for me to open it. Sister Agnes's words echoed in my head that night as I finally sat alone in my apartment, the storm from Boston still dripping off my coat. The wooden box sat on my kitchen table, small enough to fit in one hand, heavy enough to pull my whole life into question. I'd carried it out of the cathedral like it was a relic, but in truth it felt more like a curse. I lit a single lamp and opened it. Inside wasn't gold or deeds or the kind of trinkets Adrian and Luciana flaunted. Instead, there was a folded sheet of paper, brittle with age, and a small brass key on a faded red ribbon. At first, I laughed a sharp, humorless sound. After 30 years of being the family's shame, this was what Richard Marquez left me, a note and a key. But then I read the words. His handwriting shaky but deliberate, all answers lie where you least expect. Your mother knew why. For a long time, I just stared. My mother. The woman erased from every family photo, reduced to a line in whispered gossip, the secretary who should have known better. I'd been told she died in a car fire, end of story. And now here was my father from the grave telling me she had carried secrets that explained everything. I unfolded the bottom of the note and saw the letters Zurich. The brass key in the box suddenly made sense. It was for a safety deposit box halfway across the world. Zurich. Swiss banking secrecy. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I could hear it over the rain. What had my father buried in a foreign vault? And why did he tie it to my mother? Then, tucked beneath the letter, I found something else. A photograph. It was old, creased at the corners, smelling faintly of smoke. My mother stood in the center, younger than I'd ever seen her, smiling faintly. But it was the man next to her that made my breath catch. An American officer, the crisp edges of his uniform, unmistakable, his arm casually around her shoulders. Only his face had been slashed through with red ink, an angry X carved across his features. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. Who was he? A lover? A colleague? An enemy? And why would my father, meticulous in his image, keep such a damning piece of evidence hidden away from me? My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. What if my mother hadn't just been a secretary? What if she had lived an entire life I was never meant to know? I picked the photo back up with shaking hands, staring at that red X, and a sickening thought twisted in my gut. Maybe my mother didn't just die in an accident. Maybe she was erased. The box was supposed to be a consolation prize, a cruel reminder of my insignificance. Instead, it had become a fuse, and I could feel it burning fast. The photograph with its blood-red cross haunted me across the Atlantic. I carried it in my jacket pocket like a ticking clock, each glance reminding me that the life I thought I'd known was built on omissions and half-truths. The brass key pressed against my chest during the flight, heavier than gold. Zurich wasn't just a destination, it was a reckoning. The Swiss air bit cold against my face as I stepped out of the taxi, the skyline too pristine for the chaos tearing through me. The bank was exactly what I'd expected: marble columns, frosted glass, and an air of discretion that promised centuries of secrets buried beneath polished floors. They didn't ask questions when I showed the key. They never do. I was led down a corridor that smelled faintly of leather and dust into a vault chamber lined with numbered boxes. My escort stopped at 4472. I slid the brass key in, and with a metallic click, the lock gave way. Inside wasn't stacks of cash or glittering jewels, but files, ledgers, and a sealed envelope with my name on it. At the bottom, a single flash drive and a cassette tape marked in my father's handwriting for Elena. But it was the account slip tucked into the folder that made my knees buckle. Balance, $145, $327, $900, 27. I gripped the table as though the numbers might throw me off balance. All my life, I'd been the forgotten child, the girl pushed to the far end of the table, the mistake everyone hoped would vanish. And here I was, staring at a fortune that dwarfed Adrian and Luciana's combined inheritance. A twisted joke, or a final confession, Miss Marquez, a voice said behind me, calm-accented. I turned to find a man in his 60s, silver hair, slicked back, dark suit pressed to perfection. His eyes, pale blue, studied me with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "My name is Klaus Reinhardt," he said. "I have been instructed to wait for you. For 25 years." The room swayed. "By whom, your mother?" he said simply. "Isabella." Hearing her name spoken aloud after decades of silence was like being struck in the chest. I swallowed hard, the files blurring in front of me. Klaus explained slowly, methodically. My mother hadn't been merely Richard's secretary. She had been Agent Isabella Russo, an undercover CIA operative embedded within Marquez Industries to trace his laundering network. The transfers into this account, payments converted from intelligence she'd gathered, and sold insurance for the day she would run with me. My throat burned. She died in a car fire. Klaus's eyes softened. She was silenced. I wanted to deny it, to cling to the story I'd been fed as a child. But then I pressed play on the cassette, and my father's tired voice spilled into the sterile vault. "If you are hearing this, Elena, know that your mother's death was no accident. She uncovered too much. And his voice cracked, uncharacteristically human. I failed her. The truth is in these files. It is yours now. Do with it what I never had the courage to do. The tape ended. The silence roared. For the first time in my life, Richard Marquez had given me something real. And it was heavier than money. It was a weapon. The tape ended, but the silence that followed cut deeper than the words. I stared at the files spread across the table. My father's shaky handwriting bleeding through the margins, and the truth clawed its way out. My mother hadn't died in a tragic accident. She had been erased deliberately, methodically, by the very family whose name I carried like a scar. I opened the investigation file Klaus had slipped forward, the paper yellowed, brittle, yet screaming louder than any living witness. Photographs of twisted metal, a scorched vehicle on the Long Island Expressway. My mother's name in block letters, Isabella Russo. The official report was clean, too clean. Brake failure. Fatal impact, case closed. But beneath in red ink a note I'd never seen evidence of tampering. Brake line severed. Recommend homicide inquiry. My hands shook as I turned the page. Stamped across it in bold, terminated by order of Richard Marquez. My father had buried the investigation. I wanted to scream, but the air in that vault felt like cement. Later that night, I searched for answers the only way I knew how. I tracked down the people who'd lived in the shadows of the Marquez empire. That's how I found Miguel Torres, once my father's driver, now an old man living in a crumbling row house in Queens. His eyes widened when he saw me, my mother's face staring back at him through my own. He let me in without a word, poured cheap brandy into chipped glasses, and then spoke with the heaviness of a man who had carried too much for too long. I was there, he said, voice rough as gravel. The night before your mother's death, I heard the shouting in the study. Adrian, Luciana. They were children, yes, but cruel ones. They had discovered who your mother really was. CIA, they said. A spy in their house. They demanded Richard deal with her. He tried to calm them, but they were relentless. She'll ruin everything, Adrian shouted. If you don't act, we will. I gripped the glass so tightly it nearly broke. You're telling me they knew? They were part of it? Miguel nodded slowly. They bragged about it later. Not directly, but enough for me to piece it together. They didn't get their hands dirty, of course. They had someone cut the brake line. And when she died, they celebrated. Not openly. But in their eyes, I saw relief. I felt bile rise in my throat. My siblings smiling in designer suits, dripping in luxury, had murdered the only person who had ever loved me. And my father? He had let it stand. Why didn't he expose them? I demanded. Miguel's gaze dropped to his trembling hands. Because of you. He told me once after too many drinks, if the world knows what they did, Elena will never survive it. They'll come for her next. He buried the truth, gave them the empire, and hid the evidence here. He thought he was protecting you. Protecting me. The words tasted like ash. He had let my mother die, allowed her killers to inherit everything, and left me with a box of secrets as some twisted inheritance. I walked out of Miguel's house into the freezing night, my mother's face from that photograph burning in my mind. For the first time, I wasn't just the forgotten daughter. I was the heir to a blood debt, and I intended to collect. I left Miguel's house with the truth coiled around my throat like a noose. My siblings had murdered my mother, my father had buried the crime, and now I held the evidence in my hands. A vault filled with files, a fortune large enough to disappear forever, and a decision that would define whether I lived as a Marquez or as something else entirely. For 3 nights, I didn't sleep. I sat in my apartment with the files spread across the floor, the red X photograph of my mother staring at me like an accusation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Adrian's smirk, Luciana's perfect smile, both of them clinking champagne glasses at some rooftop gala, believing themselves untouchable. And in the same vision, I saw my mother burning inside a car they had condemned her to. The balance in Zurich was obscene 145 million. Enough to buy anonymity, to build a life far from Boston, far from the Marquez shadow. I could vanish into Europe, start over in a villa by the sea, never speak the name again. God knows, after 30 years of being the family's shame, I deserved peace. But every time I tried to picture that life, I heard Sister Agnes's voice. Don't seek recognition. Seek truth. That's when I called Ethan Wu. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Harvard, but he'd become exactly what I needed, an investigative journalist with a nose for blood. When I told him I had evidence of money laundering, government ties, and possibly murder, he didn't hesitate. Elena, he said, voice steady, this isn't just your family's secret. This is a national scandal. You can't bury it, not if you want your mother to rest. I wanted to hang up, to tell him I wasn't strong enough. But instead I asked, if I give this to you, what happens to me? He paused. You lose the Marquez fortune, but you gain something better, the truth, and maybe justice. So I made my choice. I copied everything, the ledgers, the transfers, the CIA reports, onto 2 encrypted drives. One I mailed anonymously to the FBI. The other I handed to Ethan in a quiet cafe, both of us pretending we were just old friends catching up over coffee. I kept nothing but a fraction 10 million siphoned into a clean account. Enough to live, not enough to corrupt. When Ethan looked at me across the table, his eyes carried both pity and admiration. You could have taken it all, he said softly. I already did, I answered, sliding the photo of my mother across to him. This is my inheritance. Truth. The rest is theirs to choke on. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter. I felt like someone holding the trigger to an empire. And I was finally ready to pull it. I didn't have to wait long for the dominoes to fall. 3 weeks after handing the evidence to Ethan and the FBI, the Marquez empire collapsed in broad daylight. It happened the way rot always reveals itself, suddenly, violently, and when the world is watching. Adrian had planned his coronation, not his funeral. The invitations called it a CEO gala, a lavish rooftop event in Manhattan, complete with champagne fountains, a string quartet, and a speech Adrian had rehearsed in the mirror for months. He wore our father's cufflinks, the same ones he'd stolen off Richard's dresser before the body was cold, and strutted across the stage like a prince inheriting his kingdom. That's when the sirens cut through the music. Helicopter blades thundered overhead. FBI agents poured through the glass doors, their jackets flashing yellow letters that left no room for doubt. For a moment, Adrian laughed, thinking it was a prank. But then he saw the handcuffs. He saw the warrant with his name bold at the top. The charges were read aloud for every guest to hear: money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder. His face drained of color as they forced him to his knees, the string quartet still sawing awkwardly at their instruments, until someone screamed. I almost felt pity watching the news feed. Almost. Luciana's downfall was quieter, but no less spectacular. She'd built her life on charm and proximity to power, draped across the arm of her senator husband, the darling of political fundraisers. But the files didn't just tie her to Adrian's schemes, they exposed her own. Secret accounts in Monaco, deals struck in candlelit restaurants, whispers of favors exchanged for votes. Within days, her husband's career was his re-election campaign dead before sunrise. Cameras swarmed them both as federal subpoenas piled up. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks as she tried to smile for reporters, but the glamour was gone. And then, like a ghost from the cathedral, she appeared again. The woman who had stared at me during the reading of the will, the stranger whose eyes had followed me like an omen. She walked into Ethan's newsroom one evening, credentials flashing. A retired CIA operative. She had worked with my mother. Her words cut through me like glass. Your mother was one of the best we ever had. She died trying to protect you. Richard tried in his own way. And now, Elena, you've done what she never had the chance to do. You ended them. I wanted to ask her 1,000 questions, but all I managed was one. Why show yourself now? She gave me a thin smile. Because now you've earned the truth, and because you're not alone anymore. For the first time in my life, I believed it. The Marquez Empire was rubble, its heirs in chains, its name poisoned on every headline. And me, the mistake, the forgotten daughter, the ghost at the table, I was the one who'd pulled the trigger. And God help me, it felt like justice. Justice came with headlines and handcuffs, but freedom came quietly. While Adrian and Luciana's mugshots looped on every news channel, I packed a single suitcase in my Boston apartment and walked out without looking back. The city of marble towers and blood-soaked wealth had given me nothing but scars. I owed it nothing in return. I boarded a one-way flight south. By the time winter snow blanketed New England, I was standing in the sweltering streets of Bogota, the air alive with chaos and possibility. With the fraction I'd kept 10 million clean and untraceable, I built something the Marquez name never could, a foundation for children orphaned by violence. Kids who, like me, had grown up on the wrong side of someone else's power. At first it was small, a rented building, mismatched furniture, volunteers scraping meals together. But when the first child looked at me, not with suspicion, not with scorn, but with trust, I knew I had inherited more than money. I had inherited purpose. Klaus Reinhardt still calls once a year, always on the anniversary of my mother's death. His voice is steady, formal, as if rehearsed. Miss Marquez, he says. Though I've long since abandoned the name, is it time to claim the account? And every year I give the same answer. Not yet. Because I know what that fortune really is, a mausoleum built out of secrets, blood, and betrayal. I refuse to chain myself to it, not when I've finally learned what freedom feels like. Sometimes when the world quiets, I find myself drawn back to the convent where I spent those early years. I sit in the same pews I scrubbed as a child, the air thick with incense and memory. Sister Agnes is long gone, but her voice lingers like candle smoke. Don't seek recognition. Seek truth. So I light a candle. For my mother Isabella, who died protecting me. For Richard, who failed in love but left me the truth. And for myself, the girl written out of the family register, who found her name in fire instead of ink. The world will remember Adrian and Luciana as criminals, their empire reduced to ash and court transcripts. But I will remember them differently, as the shadows that taught me what it means to step into the light. I no longer carry the Marquez name like a shackle. I no longer wait for their approval, their acceptance, their scraps. I am free not because of the millions gathering dust in a Swiss vault, but because I chose justice over inheritance, truth over silence. And in that choice I finally understood the greatest wealth is not money, not property, not legacy. It is the ability to walk away, to choose who you become when the chains fall away. The child who was never supposed to exist is gone. In her place stands someone new, someone unafraid, unclaimed, and at last free.